My name is Fida Adeli. I'm the academic director here at the Arab Studies program. And it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Curtis Ryan. Curtis Ryan is a professor in the Department of Government and Justice Studies at Appalachian State University. He received his BA in History and Political Science from Drew University and his MA and PhD in Political Science from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. His areas of interest and expertise include international relations and foreign policy, international and regional security, comparative politics, Middle East politics, and inter-Arab relations and foreign policy. Ryan served as a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Jordan and was twice named a Peace Scholar by the United States Institute of Peace. He's also a prolific writer, contributing to journals such as Middle East Report, Middle East Journal, and Arab Studies Quarterly, and is the author of 2 books on the Jordanian government and foreign policy, and his latest book is just outside, if you're interested in purchasing it. And this event was made possible in part by a Title VI grant from the U.S. Department of Education, which is funding a National Resource Center of the Middle East and North Africa at Georgetown. And the event's also supported by additional funding from the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies for public events. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Ryan's going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I have some slides, not text slides, most of them are photos, so there'll be little bursts of photos at some parts of the talk. But otherwise, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about the book and what the project was about and so on, and apparently there are books out there and so on. But I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Fida Adli, first of all, and Rochelle Davis, and to Samar Saeed and Dana Al-Darani for having me and organizing it, inviting me here and making this all work out, and also for the lunch. And I see you have all found the lunch, which is a very important graduate student skill. Okay? So if you're an undergraduate, it means you're grad school material. If you're grad school material, you know what you're doing. Okay? I want to tell you a little bit about the book and actually also sort of bring it to some relatively contemporary issues in Jordanian politics, because apparently I'm a little bit Jordan obsessed, because I have now written 3 books on Jordan, and this one, the latest one, Jordan and the Arab Uprisings, the title is kind of self-explanatory. But there's a whole book worth of book that ended up cut and on the floor for this one, because there was a whole part that was about Jordanian foreign policy and international relations in the country and what was going on during and after the Arab Spring and so on. And all the reviewers who disagreed on pretty much everything under the sun agreed on this part, which is, this is really good, you should totally cut it out. Right? But maybe it would be a different book. So I actually am at the point now of deciding whether 4 is too many Jordan books, or I should move on to somewhere else in my life, or not. I'm just curious, by the way, how many people are heading to Jordan in a week or so? Isn't there some contingent heading out of here? Okay, good. Hopefully by the time we're done here, you'll want to join them. Okay, I think part of the plan here. So the book, Jordan and the Arab Uprisings, is about the Hashemite Kingdom. And since I'm a political scientist, our field is conventionally divided into various subfields, which is a little odd in an area studies perspective, because very often one of our subfields is comparative politics, which is usually about the internal politics of countries. So how they work inside, what's going on in domestic politics and so on. But another field is international relations, how countries relate to each other, which gets us to foreign policy and alliance politics and war and peace and so on. But I have never really believed this really works too well in the sense of regional studies, that you really have to have a foot at least in each subfield, if not in multiple other disciplines anyway. So the way this book was constructed, the idea was to deal with the very basic question in a way, what happened in Jordan before, during, and after the Arab Spring, but also with an idea to looking at and getting an understanding of Jordanian politics long after the Arab Spring was over, right? So it wasn't meant to be just about a historical episode, it was meant to be analytical, yes, and explanatory for sure, but in a way that would still be relevant no matter what happens next. That would still be kind of a handbook for how Jordanian politics works, or what some of the key themes are. But as I said, some of the key themes didn't end up in the book in the end and got cut out of it. But the emphasis throughout the book is really on continuity and change, right? And therefore, in moving beyond just the traditional binaries that we sometimes use, especially in Western cultures, between war, peace, revolution, counter-revolution, stability, instability, etc. Since a lot of what's actually going on out in the world is not at either polar opposite ever, right? And the Jordanian case, it seems to me, is forever falling in the middle of whatever rubric one comes up with, right? And with that in mind, then, what I was actually fishing for was not a case and not a story that was about, think about the other examples from the so-called Arab Spring from 2011 onward, not just about revolutions and civil wars and attempted coups and so on, but what about a case where you have none of these things, but then it can therefore also be misread as though nothing happened there, right? And that happens, it seems to me, in Jordanian politics all the time. People treat it like nothing happened or nothing's going on. I even had a little difficulty placing this book, in fact, in the world of publishers and so on, because I was told by multiple publishers that isn't Jordan inherently boring? Which is a weird thing to say to an author who's pitching a book about Jordan, by the way, you know, but aside from the shamelessness of this, clearly Columbia University Press disagreed with this general premise, and so do I. So I think it just requires us to be more careful and analytical in figuring what's going on. It's not like nothing happened. It's just that it's not these kind of binary opposites of dramatic, huge earth-turning events are not necessarily happening. So what we actually are looking at is, well, what about smaller levels of change, incremental change, and also things that don't change. It's the continuity part. And so I'm interested in both. The book is about both. In terms of the actual project itself, this ended up being, there's the book cover. This ended up being a rather intensive project, and just in the other sort of practical measure for research, of course, is the difficulty of finding funding to get back to Jordan, to stay for a while, to do the ground research, to do the qualitative field research. Especially at a state university in the southern United States, there's not a great deal of money. In fact, usually there's zero. But this turned out to be a bit of an odd timing mechanism, that from 2011 onward, and actually it's been more than that since, but in the time I was doing the book project, I was able to get back to Jordan 10 different times, almost every time through a completely different mechanism. So there were lots of one-shot deals where I would get over there and stay, but it got me there so frequently and so consistently in this period that that's what led to the idea of focusing on Jordan, exactly what was happening. I'd been there just before the Arab Spring began. I was there, in fact, a couple of days before Jordan's own major protests emerged, which, by the way, are before most people date the Arab Spring. Jordanians were in the streets protesting just before Tunisians started coming out in Tunis. They weren't calling for the overthrow of the regime, however, so there is a dynamic difference there. They were calling for the ouster of a government, which they ended up securing, and the beginning of a long period of change relatively quickly. But this was actually within, I was there so close to this, I did end up talking to Jordanian government officials, one of whom asked me about my general impressions. So how do you find Jordan? How are things going? Because you always get that impression, or that question about your impression, do you have a finger on the pulse, what do you think? And I said, I've never heard people so angry before, and there's so much edginess. I expect people to be out in the streets. This is about 8 days or so before people got out into the streets, and I was told with absolute certainty by somebody who was soon ousted from that cabinet because of the protests that Jordanians are inherently a complaining-oriented people. He actually said this. And that I was just completely mistaken. I was just projecting this onto Jordan. There's not going to be any protests or demonstrations here. I really don't know what you're talking about. I've never brought this up to this person since then, because I just let it kind of drop. But it is also, the book is also written in such a way that it's not meant just for political science people. Mainly because I don't know how many people in this room are studying political science. I assume several at least. But there are styles to disciplinary writing, not all of which are riveting and fascinating, right? So there are some styles of political science writing that I find important and interesting and so on in terms of the research and what they're finding, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself to a great read. So the idea behind this one was to be just as analytical as, frankly, more sciencey writing might come out, more political sciencey writing. But in a way that was meant for a general audience. So I didn't want it to have to be political scientists. I didn't want it to have to be somebody from any particular discipline in order to understand what was going on in Jordan and to get something out of the book. So I am happily drawing on multiple different disciplines here, on colleagues from anthropology and economics and history and religious studies and sociology and so on, and certainly on political science as I put the whole thing together, but it was meant to be, frankly, more readable. Most important point, I think, in terms of what the focus was in two words, Jordanian voices. And that also was a stylistic choice, that I wanted to make sure that I was representing as many different types of Jordanians as I possibly could, meaning literally in their own words, right? So the book has quite a few quotations throughout it, and there are quotations by people who, if you assemble them all together at the same time, are going to be people who very vigorously disagree with each other very often, right? So part of the idea in multiple research trips building on each other is one way to make this work. Part of the idea was to go, ideologically speaking, as far to the left and as far to the right as I could possibly manage in the range of Jordanian politics, which is a pretty far range for Jordan. And as high up in the political hierarchy, if you will, as I could possibly manage to go, and as deep into the grassroots as I could manage to go. So in the course of the 10 trips or so and the several years of research that went into the book, I think I had managed to achieve that. I worked with a lot of, and meeting with a lot of very far left activists, mainstream figures, Muslim Brotherhood activists on the far right, ultra-nationalists, very hardcore ultra-nationalists on the far right. I was able to meet with King Abdullah several different times. I met with Queen Rania, I met with people in the Royal Hashemite Court, I met with multiple prime ministers and foreign ministers and cabinet ministers, and far, far more activists, demonstrators, protests, youth movements, labor movements, etc., civil society organizations. And then the trick was to try to pull it together and weave it in a tapestry that was accurate, that actually accurately represents what Jordan actually is, or maybe who Jordan actually is. And I hope I achieved that last part. So, continuity and change. The idea then was to set it up across particular categories, particular themes. One of them, of course, since this is a political science work, technically speaking, was government and opposition. So there was a lot of discussion of government, policies, reform movements past and present, and which ones seem to be more real and which sound like deja vu all over again, which seem to be sort of recycled, and also the protests in the same vein. So for every single theme, government, new opposition, old opposition, identity politics, the regional setting, reform questions, every electoral politics and electoral systems, every single theme, the idea was to structure then that theme. What was going on before the Arab Spring hit, what was Jordan's version of the Arab Spring with reference to this topic, and then what happened after that? After the Arab Spring is over, where are we now on this topic? Sort of using it, in every case, a different version of taking the pulse of a country and then hopefully pulling it back together. So on those themes, I'm going to mention just a couple things and then bring it back around to fairly recent protest movements, mainly because some of those have actually been bigger than the ones we actually saw during Jordan's version of the Arab Spring, and therefore strike me as particularly important. But of things that stood out, in the opposition category, if you will, was really the issue of reform and resistance. And so here I'm using resistance in two different ways. People who see themselves as resisting and responding to the state and trying to push it in a different direction and pushing for more reform and change, but also resistance from the state. And part of the idea there was to sort of deconstruct the state itself. It's not a monolith, just like the protest movements aren't a monolith. There are people who work at the highest levels of government who would see themselves, frankly, quite proudly as reactionaries. I think Jordan has already changed too much and don't want it to go that far. But there are also people who are sometimes frustrated, but also think Jordan, frankly, should be doing a lot more. That it should be opening up the system more, that it should be reforming a lot more, and so on, within the same halls of government. So we're looking at resistance in that sense, resistance to change, proponents of change, sometimes working side by side with each other in the state, much less social movements protesting against the state and trying to get it to sort of move, right? This led me to a couple different things. The opposition part got so big that it's the only part of the book that turned into, instead of one chapter, it's two, right? And so it's really split between traditional opposition, old school, without any judgment, old school versions of opposition, which would include traditional political parties, so the far left parties, pan-Arab nationalist parties, the Muslim Brotherhood for certain, their party, the Islamic Action Front, and the various professional associations have traditionally, at least for many, many decades now, have been traditional vehicles of opposition and mobilization and protest and demonstration. But during the Arab Spring, and to this minute, right, what was most interesting, because that struck me as really representing more continuity, right? This is where we expect the opposition to come from. These are in effect the usual suspects, right? Whereas what was interesting was the totally other chapter to this was the new activism, right? Which was much more youth-based activism, was not necessarily party affiliated, and in some cases was very self-consciously moving away from left or right parties, secular or religious organizations, and going in a completely, in a sense, nonpartisan direction, but very much very active on the grounds grassroots activism. And some of this includes what are now known as the Iraq movements, of which there were homegrown youth-based movements that sprouted up everywhere from Liban and Karak to Mafraq and Irbid, certainly in Amman itself, but all over the country. There was a point where the Iraq was such an omnipresent issue that there were sometimes protests throughout the week, but at least for the first 2 years of the Arab Spring, there were protests like clockwork every Friday at minimum, right? And not just in Amman, but throughout the country, right? And the Iraq were, what was fascinating to me about them was it was so grassroots that they never did form a truly single national movement, right? But on the other hand, and they got, significantly dinged about that by, including from other people in the opposition who were not in Iraq. But on the other hand, that was kind of the point. The point was to be grassroots and true to your local area and represent it and understand that the interests of Karak and Mafraq and Irbid and so on sometimes are similar. Right? But on some issues, there are local issues to be had that actually aren't shared with other locales. And so we saw large movements, small movements. Many of them tried to be fairly radically democratic. Some of them ideologically were very different from each other as their activism rose and fell. I think people misread this actually several years in, to the point that it became almost fashionable to say, well, the Iraq was this thing that happened during the Arab Spring, so it's become a historical moment, but it's over now. They're over now. And I think that was actually a misread, because the activists didn't leave. The activism hasn't left in any respect. It just needed something else to remobilize it. And I think this past summer, we saw something really actively mobilize it. Jordanians come out into the streets in numbers that were even greater than during the height of the Arab Spring. And Jordanian demos and protests during the Arab Spring, the big ones anyway, were in the thousands, but more often in the hundreds. But in Jordan, it's a much smaller population than some of its neighbors. Several thousand people in a demonstration is a pretty big deal, right? So it's not comparable, and I think this is also why people downplayed it, since it wasn't comparable in scale to Tahrir Square, right? And millions of people pouring out. But honestly, what is comparable to Tahrir Square, right? Nobody else in the Arab world has the population of Egypt. Nobody else had that. So it was a sort of silly comparison to begin with, and I think it led people to downplay or misread the something that was very definitely going on in Jordanian politics. The country was on the move. It was a buzz. It was vibrating. And there were people who were looking at it and not seeing any of that happening and assuming, apparently, as usual, nothing's going on here. Right? So I will come back to this if you'd like, and I'd be happy to talk more about the protest movements. But there are also the third trend I would add, besides the traditional opposition, if you will, and the Iraq movements and the sort of new forms of protest movements and opposition, were the return of a lot of single-issue activist movements against nuclear power in Mafraq, against the destruction of forests in Ajloun, and a fairly big movement to try to prevent Jordan from purchasing its gas supplies from Israel, which is also one of those movements that's kind of risen and fallen several times, but it has not dissolved. So, for example, that one too, I would say at the moment, is very often from outside viewed as though, well, they tried, right? They were big, they were complicated, they were incredibly innovative in terms of their protest style and repertoires of how they were going to do it, but ultimately they failed, and the state is going to do what it's going to do, which is purchase gas from Israel. But this is actually not completely done yet, right? And so I would put that back on the table of this story isn't over. The credits haven't rolled on this movie yet, because that movement is actually meeting in a few weeks to reconvene and try to decide what the next strategy is, and to do their final push to try to make policy change itself, and to make a full push in Parliament and beyond, and also in social activism. So that one, pay attention to that one, because that one is still on the rise and is not in any way done. It's not in any way done. Okay, so in terms of some of the other things, the toughest parts, and I mentioned this in our discussion before, the toughest part to write was the part I actually didn't want to get into, mainly because it's such a thorny issue. In any country, bringing up identity politics can be a difficult issue, but it's also one of those things that's used in different ways. There are exclusivist versions of it, there are inclusivist versions of it. This is certainly true in the United States, right? But in Jordan as well, every single topic, didn't matter what the theme was, each of which became its own chapter, but every single one at some point, in terms of the people I was talking to, the Jordanians bringing up the topic, the Jordanians discussing the topic, every single one at some point came back to identity politics. So the toughest chapter to write by far, to be faithful to it, was the identity politics chapter, because the point was to try to deal with some tough issues, right? Some social divisions and splits, without endorsing them, right? And people will very often, if you discuss matters like this, people will often misread you as though you were saying that that's a thing that has to happen, or it's been happening that way in this primordial sense and so on, and I don't have to subscribe to that. But that chapter does nonetheless get into these types of dynamics, especially how they're manipulated and used, right? And so there have been certainly reactionary elements, people who resist social change from various institutions, have been at times really adept at opening up fissures, right? Whether it's East Jordanian, Palestinian, tribal, non-tribal, or regional, north, south, east, west within Jordan, actually does have rather strong significance, or by sect or religion or whatever, and to sort of drive these various fissures in order to thwart change, to make coalitions divide themselves, in effect, almost like self-censoring yourself, and sort of splitting your own movement. But what is most interesting to me, and this is the continuity and change part, is how many of the newer movements post-2011 self-consciously moved around that, right? Could sense it coming and dodged, right? And could almost see the great division line coming, the great wedge, and decided to go around it, and very self-consciously tried to make sure that that was not happening, right? I mean, this movement on gas, for example, has been really explicit, and our summer protests, summer of 2018 protests, were really explicit in trying to preempt any attempt to divide their own movement along these lines, right? And address Jordan as Jordan, which instead of seeing all those things I just mentioned negatively, was embracing and saying, if you actually want to tell the story of Jordan as a country, as a people, and as a place, you end up having to talk about all of these, but in a positive way. How can you possibly tell the story without talking about Palestinians in Jordan, or about East Jordanians, or about the Jordanian tribes, or about the cities of the north and of the south, and so on? You would have to tell the whole thing, or you don't have a whole, right? You have little bits and pieces. But you can either do that in an inclusive, pluralist, holistic sort of way, or you can do it in a manipulative, divisive sort of way, which has a political design, which is to stop change. Right? So the final general area I want to actually mention here is the international setting. That's why I had a map up there before. It wasn't just to say, hey, look, this is where Jordan is, because I know you know where Jordan is, right? It's also, you have to, I think about Jordanian politics and think about the international setting, right? I mean, it's probably true in a way of every country, I realize. Right? But for a small country with a small population, with limited resources, and it is not one of the great oil or gas giants of the region and so on, it has played a disproportionately large part in terms of influence, which is actually in many ways remarkable in terms of how much more influential it is than by any, say, objective measure of its political or economic or military power. But if you look at the general map here and you think of it in a different way, if just look at the neighborhood, right? Is this the real estate you would choose? I mean, look to the west, right? We have Israel and Palestine, Syria to the north, even before the war, right? Lebanon to the northwest, Iraq to the northeast, Saudi Arabia to, well, much of the country's eastern and southern borders, etc. So Jordan has, for its entire existence, been in an unusual neighborhood, an unusual place. And what I'm suggesting to you is that Jordanian domestic politics is never purely domestic, right? That there's always this international setting, there's always the regional setting, and it does matter in important ways, and so the book tries to explore that, and in this case, the 2011 onward version, because here, for a country that very often tends to, especially at the state level, emphasizes regional insecurity, prizes its own alliances, is always looking for foreign investment, is always dependent on foreign aid, and therefore has to consider that in its calculations in dealing with allies in a way, but also potentially vengeful allies, ranging from Saudi Arabia to the United States and so on, of how to not alienate and keep the pipelines flowing, etc. All of these have to be in the calculus, regional actors, global actors, etc. So I see that all as critical parts of understanding it. There's also a downside to that too, which is these exact types of realities, because they are real. This is, Jordan, I would argue, from 2011 onward, had entered almost an insecurity overload, right? Where it was almost hard in every direction to look and say, okay, which is the most problematic direction to look at, right? Is it the recurring violence of bombings of Gaza and recurring issues with Israel and the Palestinians and the threat of another uprising, and what does that actually mean both for those peoples but also for Jordan itself? Is it the Syrian civil war? Is it unrest after the US invasion of Iraq 2003 onward as Iraq tried to reestablish itself? Is it the rise of terrorist movements explicitly like Al-Qaeda and Daesh or the Islamic State, etc.? Like there was just one more thing you really needed to be insecure about, right? Or from the summer of 2014 onward, we get the so-called Islamic State issue in a really big, I would say, geographic sort of way. And one of the fears there was jihadists coming home to roost in Jordan, which has now happened, right? And also people leaving the country to go fight for one of these two movements, etc. And then what to do after the war when people want to come home. And then on top of everything else, obviously, right, there is the whole issue of what to do in terms of not jihadists and armies and movements, but what about just normal people fleeing the country and getting into Jordan itself, or trying to flee from the problems of Syria and of Iraq for that matter. And that gets us to the refugee issue. And before we get there, I'm only pulling up the picture because this is the royal family, right, a part of the royal family. Anyway, so the king and the queen, and I felt it was important to show a Georgetown graduate in my presentation. So the crown prince and designated successor to the throne, Prince Hussein, named after his great-grandfather, the late King Hussein, his grandfather, late King Hussein, is the designated successor to the throne, but he's also a recent Georgetown grad. So for those of you who are not all about, for whatever weird reason, if you're not Jordan obsessive, which I don't even understand, but I understand there are people who are like that, I don't get it. But if you're not one of these people who obsess about Jordan like I do, there is a actually heavy Georgetown connection to the Hashemite kingdom. So Prince Talal, for example, is quite the Georgetown alum as well. And honestly, I don't think anybody knows more about Hoya basketball than that guy. I just said it, right? Credit where credit is due. So the Arab Spring was the whole issue here, and Jordan's version, I mean, okay, that's not Tahrir Square, but that's a lot of people, right, coming out to a demonstration. And one of the things that actually was sort of a hallmark of a lot of these demonstrations, including this one in particular, was the use of patriotic symbols very explicitly. That's not unique to Jordan. We saw that in Tunisia, we saw it in Egypt, we saw it in every country. There's a sort of savvy mechanism of grassroots demonstrators of taking the weapon that's used against dissidents everywhere, which is to question their patriotism, right? First line of defense of besieged any government is to question the patriotism of someone who's questioning you, in fact, right? But that is not something that ended up as part of this dynamic because the Jordanian flags were omnipresent, including, that's a fairly large Jordanian flag, I think we can agree, right? And if you had that in your apartment, you'd be like, where am I going to put that? I don't really know. It seemed like a good idea, but it's so large now, right? So it's, we have this everywhere in all these demonstrations, and we saw it again in the big demos in the summer, and actually some of the ones that are going on right now. There's some labor mobilization going on right now in Jordan as well, and there is always this sort of embracing of these patriotic symbols, so that you can't be, so that your loyalty is rather clear as part of the demonstration. I see that as a kind of important defense mechanism. But the other thing actually is worth remembering is that there was some pretty, there was turmoil of a sort anywhere. We're not talking about revolution, we're not talking about civil war, we're talking about this sort of middle gray area version. But Jordan saw 5 governments in less than 2 years, cabinets rising and falling. And even in a country where cabinets are notoriously short-lived, right? And prime ministers are fired relatively frequently, that was an incredibly fast rate, and that has sort of slowed down since in the last several years. But 5 governments in less than 2 years was remarkable. It was almost head-spinning level of change. And protesters routinely in the streets, especially in the first 2 years, pushing and pushing and pushing. But the wild card issue, I think, in some ways was this one, right? That it's also, and this is why the international context matters so much, that it therefore becomes the domestic context. There's no way to really talk about Jordanian politics and Jordan's experience during the Arab Spring without at some point talking about refugees in the country, right? And refugees, as you know, are a controversial issue, at least for some people in the United States, right? And there's a lot of misunderstanding about who the Syrian refugees are, etc. And the U.S. is basically, under the new administration, recent administration, current one, has cut them off from the country. But what most people who talk about this issue don't seem to realize is if there's such a thing as an average Syrian refugee, it's a 13-year-old girl, right? Most of the refugees are children, most are female, this is the average age, right? So when we're talking about all the great security threats that various governments and regimes seem to trot out when they look at the refugee issue, if you actually go, if any of you go, or have gone, or will go, to the camps themselves, there's actually no way you can come away with that as your rubric for how to think about this issue. It's just not even possible, right? So Jordan ended up having to deal, this is from the Zaatari camp in the far north, not far from Mafraq, right? Dealing with the refugee issue, even as we're having these reform and resistance struggles going on inside the kingdom. War is breaking out on multiple different borders. Terrorist movements are setting up shop in a couple different places, and they do in fact have designs on Jordan as well as other countries. And then meanwhile, right, at least 650,000 Syrian refugees pour into the Kingdom of Jordan. The official stats are double that, actually, right? So it's at least 650,000 registered refugees, of which there are several hundred thousand who are not registered as well. So the standard number that the Jordanian government uses is 1.3 million, right? In a country that's just over 7 million, so think about that proportionally speaking, right? The Jordanian government has routinely used the same example to talk about this, and they will. There's going to be a big conference in London on the 28th of this month to try to get all the donors together to try to actually come through with all the pledges they keep making for Jordan, etc. And bear in mind, a side note, that part of the pledges is not just about, let's say, their generosity or their empathy for the refugees. Some of the Western donors in particular, part of the deal, and they have cut a deal with Jordan, is to try to be more supportive of the kingdom and the refugee issue, because they don't want the refugees going to Europe, to keep quite blunt, right? I mean, part of the deal is if you keep them there, we will at least provide the funding. I mean, that's really what is going on with this, right? But the funding that's necessary to make this work is staggering. This is actually shot from just one edge of the camp, which is the tent version. Most of it has changed over the years, actually quite dramatically. The Zaatari camp, so it includes more, in the U.S. it would be a trailer, basically, caravan in British English, but the caravans or trailers are, brought in and dropped in one spot. It's basically a one-room prefab little building. And some of the people in the camp, by the way, who are dealing with this have been quite creative about how they do this. So sometimes people have been able to get more than one and sort of jam them together and actually get a certain level of privacy. Because you're talking about entire families stuffed into one little room in the northern part of the country in the desert, where every season is a problem, right? Rainy season, heat, snow, every single season has its own disasters and dilemmas to actually deal with. And the thing that I don't think people quite get is the scale, right? This is just the Zaatari camp, right? Which ended up, I think at this point, last I checked, we're at maybe 80,000 people in a camp that was originally set up to accommodate 6,000, right? But the thing I actually want you to think about as you look at the picture is the aerial shot couldn't get the whole camp hit, right? That's already telling, right? The more it can't fit it in the camp is two things. One, most refugees aren't in your picture. The overwhelming majority of refugees aren't in the camp. They're in various other parts of Jordan, in cities and so on. So the issue for Jordan's water supplies and its economy and its services and medical care and everything, and education, because the majority of the refugees are children, is a rather big deal. Syrian children have been allowed into Jordanian schools. Limited number have actually gotten work permits, and the idea is to expand this, but so far it's been relatively limited. But each one of these has been a sort of slow, piecemeal response to a crisis, because at first it wasn't clear how long is a crisis? Are they going back in 6 months or a year? But that was 2011, it's 2019, right? So we're way past crisis mode, right? We're at the moment of long-term planning mode of what actually happens next, because before 2011, there wasn't a single building in this spot. There was nothing there. Nobody would take that picture, right? There's nothing to see, nothing, right? And that could end up becoming an actual city over time. It's not clear to me where this is actually really going to go, right? But the refugee issue, as I said, is something that had to be part of it. So it actually does end up becoming a rather big part of the book itself. And the other thing I told you I was going to work my way around to, so I'm working my way around to it, and then I want to see where you want to go in terms of questions and so on, is the relatively recent protest. So in less than a year ago, in the summer, in 2018, which was during the holy month of Ramadan, right, which did have an effect on the protests, especially on the timing, and mostly just in terms of a clock, meaning most of the protests were nighttime protests. So it wasn't a religious or secular reference there. Because most people would wait till they had fasted all day, break the fast, it's nightfall, then go out and protest. So this became every single night. But it was also another one where I think at least initially people looked at incredibly large numbers of people turning out, not just in Amman, but in multiple cities all over the country, which is a hugely important point, because very often a lot of international media descended on the capital, of course. Almost everybody stays in the same hotel. The Jordanian Intercontinental Hotel is like the land of journalists when there's a crisis. So all of a sudden, all the rooms are filled up with journalists. If you want to hang in the lobby and see famous people come and go, it's not a bad thing to do, to spend an afternoon, right? Watch famous people walking out of the Intercon, etc. in a hotel that I can't afford to stay in. But I find it entertaining to watch other people who do, right? So lots of people out here, right? Lots of people showing up for this after dark in the evening. But at first, it was a called strike, right? And so there's also significance to that. For the first time in Jordanian history, every major labor organization and union combined together for a collective strike, right? An actual, truly general strike, meaning across the country, everywhere, everybody. Right? So we've had labor organization. In fact, Dr. Adley's work on this is the best thing I've still read on this topic, but is the most understudied issue is the labor movements in Jordan right now, right? So her piece in Middle East Report is still fabulous. You should read it. But this was looked at first like, okay, is that what we're looking at here? Because all these unions and so on got active, all these professional associations. So it looked like a called one-day strike, right, which was already important and significant and huge. But it quickly, and by quickly I mean in about a half an hour, it morphed into something else, right? Because the number of people came out was way beyond the entire union membership, right? Most of these people aren't in the unions, right? And some of the organizers themselves were a little startled. In other words, this is more successful than we thought it was going to be. And they actually had to have an emergency meeting in the first 24 hours, which is, we said one day's work stoppage. Are we going to keep going? Right? Because we haven't achieved anything yet. You know, I mean, we meant it as a sort of demonstration effect. And the decision was made to keep going, but what I'm suggesting to you is a lot of the people participating, I'm not sure they're waiting for anybody to make a decision, right? They weren't following any centralized leadership. They weren't partisans, right? So these were so huge because they included all the unions, all the labor movements, etc. And it looked at first like a middle-class tax revolt, meaning these were professional associations objecting to tax increases and price increases. But the number of people that came out was about 1,000 times the original organization maybe, and as I said, all over the country. And they were protesting something way bigger than that. Yes, they were protesting tax increases, the idea of introducing income tax that is, most Jordanians don't actually pay income tax, right? So there's part of an idea to actually make the tax code work, collect taxes that haven't been collected, to change the way it works to get people to start paying income tax, etc. But if it sounds like some kind of tax heaven, most Jordanians pay more in sales taxes than most people in other countries. So it comes out of their wallet in a different way, and the burden is really extensive, right? And you already have a country where the cost of food and of housing is among the highest in the entire region, especially in the capital Amman. So many Jordanians will correctly point out we have a cost of living that's like Abu Dhabi and Dubai without the money of Abu Dhabi and Dubai, right? So it's almost inexplicable how that we got to this point, but there's a lot of anger about this, and you can see it. And one of the things that happened right off the bat was how many people actually showed up. Note patriotic symbols everywhere as well, and again at night. Right? So if the idea, and there were some people speculating about this, was the idea to say, well, we'll get, if you actually put these measures through during Ramadan, it will kind of receive a sort of muffled response. It's not clear to me that that was intended at all, by the way, but this is not a muffled response anyway, whether that was intended or not, because instead of, say, having some activists go out, or some protesters, or some strikers, what you actually got is multiple generations of the same family all saying, is everybody good? Everyone's eaten. You've all eaten? Okay, we'll put everything in various containers, and we'll come back and nosh later. But, let's all go out now, and whole generations are going out. So the visual part that was really striking to me was that in a lot of the demonstrations themselves, you had the sort of learning going on from the previous rounds of Arab Spring protests. And I mean in both directions. A lot of learning on the part of the police and the gendarmerie or the Darak in Jordan and how to respond to this, and a lot of learning in terms of protesters, what works, what are the red lines, what can we do, where can we push, and you can actually almost see a kind of urban geography develop, right? Where at the very front, meaning right in the face of the police officers in the Darak, you had some hardcore activists. If you wanted to figure out where the Iraq were, especially for everybody who thought the Iraq were dead, this is where they are. They're up in front, they're in the demonstrations, they're young, they're organized, they're enthusiastic, they're right in the face of the Darak and the police and so on. But as you kind of go back, you saw people who were then with the unions and with political parties and with the Muslim Brotherhood, etc., but there too, without any of the symbols. Right? So the parties, left, pan-Arab, right-wing, had all made a collective decision through a number of party organizations not to come with their banners. Right? We're not going to bring the Jordanian Communist Party banner or the Ikhwan banner, the Muslim Brotherhood banner, whatever. We're just going to come as Jordanian citizens, again, with the idea that we're preempting you. You can't then say, oh, it's just an Islamist protest, or it's just the leftists are agitated again, or it's just this ethnic group, or whatever. We're going to sort of take that card away from you. And that is a whole other layer. And then behind them, and this in some ways was almost the most entertaining part, was entire families. So we had brigades of strollers and so on, and toddlers and little kids, and sort of the outer perimeter in the way back, so they're not up where things might get a little dicey. And most of the protests, there were some exceptions, but the protests themselves were mostly peaceful and stable and so on. And then they went on night after night after night, and there was a collective, consistent set of things that people were protesting, right? Against the price hikes, against tax hikes, against austerity measures, honestly, of any kind, coming from the IMF or any of their ilk, right? And there is, I would say, if it's possible to generalize about the population of the entire country, and it probably isn't, but at the risk of making an error here, if it's possible to make a generalization, it would be that most Jordanians, and I think this is fair to say, feel like there's nothing left in their pocket. They've been drained, there's nothing left. So we got a lot of really clever memes and so on, a lot of very funny use of social media, of people. There was even somebody who dressed up with cardboard box who would look like an ATM machine with like a big X on it and so on, saying the Jordanian people are not an ATM machine. You can't keep tapping this population that doesn't have much to try to get more resources. And in some ways, the message was clearly meant at the government, at the prime minister and cabinet and so on, right? And they were calling for Yasser, the prime minister, who within 5 days was gone, right? But they're also calling for change in policy. And in some ways, though, the message wasn't just for the Jordanian government, it was for institutions in this town not so far from here, where the IMF and World Bank are located, right? And to try to get them on board with what was actually going on. So let me show you just a couple quick shots. This is actually the getting ready for it, right? There was a sort of organized response to it. Our guy with the quickly made sign, if you can see that, I don't know, as a scorecard. He's really enjoying himself at the protest, which is an important thing, by the way. But his scorecard basically says the people won, government zero. Right? This is right after the government actually resigned. and they were suggested they would resign. But most of these things were peaceful. And actually we also saw very, very, very large numbers of women as core activists and leaders of protests and chants and demonstrations all over the country as well. So what struck me most about this, in addition to everything I've already said, is that these struck me as the most eclectic, most diverse that I have ever seen in covering Jordan, meaning by identity issues in every sense, by gender, by social class, by ethnicity, by religion, and by age, by generation, right? These protests were Jordanians of all walks of life and social classes and so on coming out as citizens, not subjects, right? And trying to push for something very, very different. And they will get part of what they're actually looking for. I mean, the number of kids on people's shoulders, for example, I'm pretty sure, I don't think anyone has bothered measuring that before as a metric. Like, you know, how many were there at a protest, for example? Because usually the answer was none in a lot of other protests. You know, your standard Friday downtown protest that the Muslim Brotherhood organizes doesn't look like this, right? It's just a different style, if you will. But this became a big part of what people were seeing and therefore were confused about. And I reiterate, there were people in the state itself, remember, who don't see themselves as part of the anti-reform resistance, right? Who see themselves as reformers, who were quite enthusiastic about this and were welcoming it, saying, this is helping us win the argument against the people we think of as reactionaries, etc. And we're supportive of it. So the state is not, this is not like, it's not comparable to, say, Sisi responding to a protest if it happens next week in Egypt. I think you're going to get a completely different dynamic, right? Some of these got, you know, really, really, really large. Some of them, and see, these are still photos, and the thing that you can never capture in still photos is, of course, the movement and sound, right? But a lot of Jordanian protests, especially these, especially as they wore on and people knew what to expect, it's night 3, it's night 4, it's night 5, etc., got more and more musical and rhythmic, etc. So we have pounding drums and soundtracks to the whole thing, a spontaneous chants, some of which were really, really clever, etc., that some of which went viral, so that's actually worth seeing. And it does lead us to, I would argue, maybe where we are now, right? Which is that the government, very unpopular government, was ousted. Hani al-Mulki was the prime minister. He's ousted, but the thing is, when he came in, he had really no choice but to be unpopular. He was literally given a letter of designation that basically said, here are all the terrible things you have to do, right? It was a whole list of austerity measures. You have to basically tighten the belt of an entire country. So it's going to be, of all the prime ministers ever, this is going to be the most thankless, and it turned out to be exactly that. So we do get a change here, right? Not just a change in government, but there's a change in, not from central casting, I would argue, at least in terms of the prime minister. A lot of people in the cabinet, some were new faces, a lot are not, a lot are sort of recycled in various respects. But Omar al-Razaz is the prime minister of Jordan. He was named at the height of these protests and so on, was coming from a sort of different angle, not from, say, a far left or activist or progressive background necessarily, but in this context, he's usually seen as more liberal than most state officials say. He's been very supportive of a lot of reform and change. He was part of the Jordan Strategy Forum. So people were reading this in kind of 2 different ways. Well, he's not a traditional conservative prime minister, so that's different. He's somebody who's actually been really supportive of democratization and change in the kingdom, so that's actually really different in terms of appointees. But on the other hand, that forum and a lot of these institutions are associated with a very neoliberal approach to development, which is what a lot of people are protesting against, right? So there are people who looked at the exact same appointment and thought, I'm actually not sure how I feel about this, right? And right now, it's been going on for a while, but that's actually behind him is the spokesperson for the government. Shumana Ben-Mat was the editor of Al-Qad, which is the most popular Arabic daily in the kingdom, is now head of communications. So both of them, I would argue, were a little bit breaking the traditional mold, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. But there are also some hardcore conservatives put into the cabinet immediately, and I would argue Jordanian cabinets are usually signals to different communities, and so they're not to panic in terms of where this is actually going to go. But now we've kind of gotten to a different level where people are expecting a lot of change, something different, and there's at least some level of disappointment, but I would still argue this is, the night is young, if you will. This was only last June And this is a country that has been pummeled by regional affairs, by however many refugees have crossed the border, whether it's 650,000 or 1.3 million, that is dealing with security issues in every direction. And I reiterate that there are real issues there. Those are not made up, they're not hypothetical in the Jordanian case, but they can be used sometimes as excuses for what to do next or what we can't do next. And what I would suggest to you, if you visualize that map I had up before, is there's not really going to be a time when the neighborhood turns out to be warm and fuzzy and all secure, right? The idea of Jordan having external security threats and all these things to deal with, I would argue is a constant from the first day of independence in 1946 till sometime next year and well beyond, right? So that'll always be the case. It's just a question of which version of it do we have now that we can actually look at. So bringing it back to the book, and then I'll see where you want to go. The idea behind the book itself was to get beyond the whole idea of binaries, to explore them, to try to be faithful to the actual country, to create a kind of fair and inclusive assessment that's actually hopefully a good read, hence all the quotes and Jordanian voices that are involved in the book. And then I would say, just in terms of way of conclusion, one of the big themes that pulls the whole thing together, of course, is the question of reform and change, and resistance to reform and change, and therefore the recurring issue of protest. Protests predated 2011, they will post-date 2011, and the short version I would say is this, is the Arab Spring is long over, right? But the book was set up in such a way that it was supposed to be, and I think it is, about Jordanian politics before, during, and long after the Arab Spring. So the Arab Spring may be over, but activism in Jordan is not, right? And so the whole mythology of Jordan is quiet, or a place that something doesn't happen is just complete nonsense, right? I don't know if I just converted you to be kind of a complete Jordan file, but if I did, then yay. If I didn't, I don't know what's wrong with you. So just go get some more food, you could do that, and then maybe I'll convert you shortly after that. But why don't I stop there, and thank you for all your attention there, and then see where you'd like to go in terms of questions. Yes?
You're focusing on Jordan after the Arab Uprising, because you're familiar that there had been riots since the 80s, the bread riots, and there had been always protests. I attended like 20 at least protests like this one.
Yeah, actually,
but not with the new thing is that there were people who are not reformers or human rights activists or political activists that were in that protest. Maybe that's why it became so popular. And another thing, that the Al Jazeera is banned from Jordan in 2017, and even before it was allowed, but only to cover up under censorship.
Yeah, and actually I think part of that is about just their coverage in general, Al Jazeera. But also part of it is that the relationship government to government between the Jordanian government and Qatar has been sort of dicey. It's sort of hot, cold, hot, cold, hot,
it's
cold.
after the Saudis boycotted Qatar.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so, but there too, I mean, in terms of beyond the binaries and moving in the middle, Jordan has tried to go oddly middle, even on the boycott, going along with some things and completely ignoring other things. So it doesn't want to go all in with the Saudis, but it doesn't want to alienate them either at the same time. But on the '89 protests in particular, that actually is in the book. So since the book is about before, during, and after, in discussing and writing about the protests, it also covers the earlier rounds, and then with a view to seeing and I agree with you in terms of what you were saying was different about it, what's similar was different. But yeah, that was the idea, was to sort of tease out what was similar, what was different. To what extent was this '89 all over again, and to what extent was this something new? And I think we have a little both going on, right? And which is the part I find fascinating.
And ousting the cabinet is a very common practice also.
Is what now?
Ousting the cabinet every time there is. That's very common. It's not new.
Yeah, exactly.
Not
Yeah,
within
that's
the past 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that, in fact, it's the cycle. The number of cabinets in that 2-year period was a record, but most last average, if you average them all together from the 50s onward, a year is about the average, which is pretty short. By any measure, that's pretty short. Yes.
So I just want to thanks so much for this really interesting presentation, and I've read some of the book but haven't finished it yet, so I apologize if this is in there. I was also in Jordan quite a bit between 2010 and 2012,
Yeah.
and I felt, exactly what you said, anger, but also like a palpable kind of shifting of red lines that was happening, particularly in 2011, and you talk about that in the book, right? Just kind of the discourse changing. But at the same time, there are particular moments in which things seem to go too far from the perspective of the government, and so they would sort of step in, not in a massively repressive way, that's right, that's never been Jordan's way to just shoot down protesters in the street, but arresting leadership, harassing people, firing people from their jobs, etc. And I didn't follow I can't say that I followed the 2018 protests as closely as I did this earlier period, but my sense was there was a lot more repression because, and I'm assuming that's because this was a lot more threatening. And you talked about the Iraq in particular as the government's perception of the Iraq, or elements of the government, as particularly dangerous because it's new, it's different, it's crossing these kind of divisions. And so, yeah. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about kind of repression, like there were new press laws passed after the Arab Spring, right? And yeah, and just talk about whether in 2018 or how the government's trying to control, or the elements of the government that are concerned about this, right? Which is
it's a really interesting question, and I agree with the way you characterized it. Well, I think all this, and so all these themes, I mean, none of them are brand new, right? That's the whole point, is just to see what's new about the theme, because the fact that it's a theme implies it's been there for a while in a way, right? So what way is the issue? And here, I would say that the standard, I'd actually even have a term for it, right? That the security forces have tended to use what they have termed soft security as their approach. So, which doesn't mean no coercion, right? It doesn't mean no security. I mean, there's still that. But we haven't seen, I guess you might think of it, relative to the neighbors, we haven't seen, as actually one activist pointed out, we don't have snipers on the rooftops here, is what she was saying. And we don't have people, gunning.
And in urban, they're hacking something.
Yeah, this was an Amman activist, so there you go. So there you go, right?
Can we just,
But,
we should let the speaker answer the question, thank you. Yeah.
But, well, I think compared to, we haven't seen the kind of response that we've gotten in, say, to big protests that you would get in Yemen or Egypt or some of the other countries of the region. But on the other hand, as pretty much every activist in the kingdom says, but on the other hand, do we need to use that as what kind of standard is that?
Yeah.
This horrible thing didn't happen, so is that okay? That's sort of a weird standard to come up with. But it's sometimes sort of brought out and to say, look, we use soft security, and there's this protest where the Iraq actually distributed water bottles to everyone and so on. And these things did happen, but they're also, in a world of viral videos that people are taking on their phones, we know that there were people who were roughed up in some of them. And some of them, though, but I do think it's actually qualitatively different for most of the neighbors. And yet, at the same time, there have been other, even softer ways of diffusing, not just protests, but actually people. For example, following who was involved in the protests and not necessarily going after them at that moment, but them finding that mysteriously, miraculously, all their job contracts for this business they run have just vanished, right? There are other ways to sort of press your elbow on people and get them to adjust their behavior or diffuse a movement. We've had, and I'm not going to name names, and I should have said this at the very beginning, given the delicacy of a lot of the topics and the fact that I'm using a lot of Jordanian voices and so on, it also changed in the nature of the research. And in social sciences, we tend to be very cognizant, I hope, most of us, of the ethics of who you're getting information from and using their names and so on, and being careful about that. So I was throughout the book, but I actually had to go backwards and make people anonymous who originally weren't, who originally had been very public and saying, no, I want to be quoted, I want you to say who I was. And then 3 years later, the situation was actually noticeably different. So even though I had the permission to quote by name twice as 3-4 times as many people as I actually did, I went backwards and re-anonymized, people, if that's a word I made up, but made them anonymous again over these issues, because and some of them were activists who thought, this is a totally new world, 2011, 2012, maybe 2013, but from that moment on, it got different. The tone was different. What the red lines were, red lines I would argue reappeared in various places. There have been people who, you know, were supposed to be actually in the United States, in fact, even to accept awards and things like that, who have not been able to do so because, you know, visa has been held up for 8 years and so on, which is bureaucratically impossible. So there are other ways, and I think we've seen a lot of that. You mentioned the press laws, however. And so Jordan has changed his press and publication laws quite a few times over the years. There was a colossal one that came out in 1998, which was a huge change at that point. So that was almost 10 years after the big April 1989 uprisings and riots and so on and protests. But what was different to me in 2011 and after was that Jordan had some restrictive press and publication laws, but mostly for print publications. Right? And so in 2011 and after, it sort of entered that moment as having the most open approach, I would argue, to the internet in particular of any Arab country, to the point that there were people measuring it in 2011 and 2012 and noting how much Arabic content on the internet came from one rather small country, Jordan. I mean, its role in that is actually staggeringly large, still is actually. But they changed the rules, right? In 2011, 2012, and so on, there were new rules for websites. And the idea and I try to do this throughout the book, by the way, is to make sure I am representing what do people think they're doing and what is the response to it. So both versions of the story, or 2 or 3 or 4 versions of the story, are going to be in there, rather than just one twist or take. But this includes people who are arguing that there's a lot of defamation going on. There are a lot of websites where they're not really qualified journalists. So we have all these news websites, and so they came up with very restrictive rules, including a really significant amount of capital you needed to have the website continue, and you had to have an editor that was a member of the Jordan Press Association, which was entirely print media journalists. So almost nobody had one of those, right? So in 2 different ways, one a financial mechanism, one a sort of institutional requirement, they were both means of shutting down websites. And so websites that couldn't manage to do it, hundreds of them were shut down. Others resisted, and eventually some of them did get through the walls and came up with somebody on their staff, did have to comply in the end in order to continue working. And some, I will say, were tremendously creative about it. But I would add one other layer, because we're having one of those debates right now, right this minute. There are laws proposed, legal changes going through there, so they're not done. They're sort of in the middle mark between the 2 houses of parliament, whether or not they get signed off on, and a lot of public resistance about freedom of speech issues. And this time it's not, I think it's still a spin-off of the old website issue when it first came up in 2011, 2012, but this time it's about, something's going to sound familiar to debates in the US, fake news, right? And so the whole debate is can you actually make that a law? Like if you publish fake news and it's defamatory or something like that, can you move against people? And there are proposals to do this, but the haggle over it has been really 2 things. 1, can you make this an illegal thing at all, right? And 2, if you answered yes to the first question, how do you define fake news, right? Or how do you define, for example, the first go-arounds were, well, we need malicious fake news. Okay, what's malicious, right? And so I would say that the pushback has actually been tremendous in a good way, and so I'm not sure where this is going to go, but it's back to the center of Jordanian politics again, and it will have a huge impact on what people are allowed to say, write, see, hear, etc. So there's a really vigorous debate going on about this. What can you do? What should you do about these issues, and so on? Yes.
You mentioned that if the protesters put up a banner with Muslim Brotherhood or Palestinian nationhood or other off-limits identity political grievances, that would be immediately shut down. So how do you know that, whereas if they do this economic related protests about tax and cost of living, they know that definitely the international media and the government will have to kind of take that a bit more seriously. So especially when you said that the protests often exceed the number of people that are within these labor unions, how do you know that they're really there for tax or for cost of living?
I'm interested in asking you about to what extent do you find it sustainable, this idea of, because Jordan plays it in terms of you want to please the people and therefore remove the government, and also because the government is being inefficient, and you remove the government as well. But as you said, the average has been a year in terms of, so to what extent is this going to be a sustainable tactic to maintain the stability within the country from both the political side and the civil society side?
I was just wondering if you might be able to speak a bit about what you see the role of student protest and activism within sort of the continuities and changes, notably sort of protest movements at the University of Jordan, Yarmouk University, 2011 to 2013, but as well as over the past year or two.
Yeah, good questions. Thanks for all those questions. Good stuff. Let's see. In terms of the way, I do think there are a difference in reactions to how a protest or demonstration is perceived. If it can be easily typecast as the Muslim Brotherhood, and usually for some of the protests there is a leadership group, right? The Muslim Brotherhood, for example, has called countless protests, and the Muslim Brotherhood is as old as the state of Jordan, right? So we've been doing this since 1946 and so on. But when they call one, there are certain predictable styles. It tends to be a march. They tend to start downtown, etc. And there's some red lines that go with it of where is acceptable to go, how far. Can you go to the Israeli embassy? To some extent, the answer is yes, but only so close. There's even understood red lines. The work of Gillian Schwedler on this is simply magnificent in terms of detail, of even yard markers of which step is too far, when you know the police are going to move against you, and which is actually totally acceptable and that is not too close. But the idea then of saying, okay, well, economic protests, cost of living protests, anti-tax protests, don't generate that same kind of response. I think there's something to that, yes. But your question was, okay, well, how do we know that that's what they're there for? But that, I think, also brings us back to that other question of that these protests, I think, that's why I don't think that other one, the recent one, was the middle class tax revolt. I mean, for some people who were middle class and, tax revolt, okay, that's how it started. But it quickly was about a whole list of grievances. And to me, the most important part of all these things is however the protest ends, whether a government rises and falls based on it. The bigger issues, the things that led people out into the streets in the first place, in the Arab Spring, and honestly in the 1989 protests as well, are really similar issues. There are, some of them are economic issues, so we also get that some of kind of bifurcation of sometimes even from analysts. Are these political protests or economic protests, right? Which I always find a kind of inane question, right? Because the answer is yes, right? I mean, some of the issues are economic. They're bread and butter issues. Can I feed my family? The cost of living is ludicrous. The cost of food is ridiculous. The cost of, and it changes family life. It changes when people are able to get married, etc. It changes what happens in home life. All these things matter, but these are all political things as well. All of this is politics, right? They're not political. And so everything always ends up coming back to, at some point, the tax issues, the austerity issues, the price issues, but also corruption issues. I mean, if there's something, there's another of those on the short list of things. If you could actually poll the whole country and get them to say what are your top issues, an overwhelming majority of people would complain about corruption. I mean, that is a consistent issue of corruption in public life. And they don't necessarily mean everybody, but in the context of neoliberalism and privatization and so on, that any country, anywhere, that always increases the possibilities for corruption, right? And so we've actually seen that as a consistent issue. So I don't think it actually is necessarily a question of are people there just for that one economic issue. I think every protest, people are there for an eclectic set of issues. They might have a different priority list, but they kind of coalesce together, and the bigger the protest, the more diverse that set of demands is going to get. And that, to me, is the point. Protests only work as coalitions. Coalition building is what achieves change, not your single issue, which can get shot down or sidelined or typecast, right? In terms of the sustainability issue, removing a prime minister and moving against it, whether that actually is workable, no, I actually don't think it is. But there too, I find that actually a kind of fascinating part of the politics, because removing prime ministers, reshuffling cabinets happens in a lot of countries and a lot of societies, but it has been a standard mechanism in Jordanian politics under more than one regime. And a quick side note here, when I say regime, I mean governing system, right? It's a generic term, I didn't invent it, right? It's part of the subtitle of the book, and there's been a tremendous amount of pushback from government officials in Jordan that I dared to use this term, right? As though I made it up, or it has some terrible, terrible meaning. It's just the ruling system. That's it. It's just a generic term. It's like saying the government. I don't know, the ruling system. But it has been a standard tactic. I mean, King Hussein routinely fired prime ministers, reshuffled cabinets, and so on. So I'm going to quote a Jordanian for you about this, because in a certain level of frustration over this same issue, I was making that argument and saying, this and the economic issue together, right? I said, ultimately, this is just not sustainable. And this is a Jordanian former government official who said, well, of course it's not sustainable, it's just sustained anyway. Right? And I thought that almost should, if I could have made that the book title somehow, I would have, but I couldn't figure out a clever way to do it. But that was kind of insightful. I really thought is that it's not really sustainable. By every measure, this shouldn't actually work, right? But it also means you might think of it strategically then, right? Because there's a knee-jerk government state response and security forces response maybe sometimes to protests, but also on that part of protests, demonstrators, activists, do you want the government always dismissed? Is that what you should actually be asking for? Because if it's such a standard practice, then what you might actually get is you're actually resetting the clock over and over again and putting yourself backwards, rather than you might have actually achieved something, you got the government dismissed. But if it just resets the clock, it just bought time for the people who didn't want to do any change in the first place. So there's a downside to it as well, and the part I think people might want to think about, especially with the current government, of somebody who has in the past been more pro-reform, certainly, is as opposed to what is the other part. If not this government, what are you likely to get as a replacement? It's probably worth thinking about tactically and strategically. And the last question really was about, the student movements, which is a great question. I would say the youth factor has actually steadily increased in these protest movements, and I can't perfectly trace that. But I think certainly Hirak was part of that. But we saw university activism, I would argue, predated Hirak, right? And almost predicted it in a weird sort of way. But at particular campuses, certainly at the University of Jordan, certainly at Yarmouk University, and so on, we've seen tremendous amounts of student activism over the years. There was a lot of student activism before the '89 April protests and so on, that some people were calling an uprising, and some people were saying demonstrations and protests. But there was a lot in the late '80s, especially in the Yarmouk campus in Irbid. So I think there's actually a long tradition of activism on there, and very political. Sometimes student elections tend to actually reflect this. Lots of student demonstrations, and you can probably tell from my tone, I think there's an appropriate way to deal with that. I personally would welcome student activism and protests on any campus, but I'm not in charge of Jordanian university campuses or any others. But I think you also get a window on where things really stand in terms of how open or closed the reaction is. And technically, that's the university administration making a decision, right? But in most cases, it's making a decision, reading the signals they've gotten from the state itself of which window are we in now? Are we the one where we're supposed to let this roll and just let it ride? Or are we the one where you want me to clamp down real quick on this and actually go more nuclear on some of them? Dismissing students, for example, expelling students, or similar, softer pedal, but nonetheless, measures moving against them where they can't re-enroll mysteriously somehow, etc. Or you move against members of the family and their businesses and so on, one way or another. So we've had all of these, but I would say it's been wildly inconsistent. You can almost trace how open or closed the door is to how student activism has been treated, right? Because I think it's also seen by people who are hostile to it. I think they see it as a gateway thing to it, in a fairly naive way, but a gateway to other forms of activism. But I return to my original point, like there hasn't been enough, you're not seeing activism. I mean, I see it as truly huge youth factor that absolutely is critical to the whole thing. And like most other countries in the region, and all of you, know a lot about the Middle East, I know, and in particular about Jordan in many cases. The great paradox in many ways is you're talking about some of the world's oldest peoples, but some of the world's youngest countries, right? With not just in the sense of political borders and when the country was created by some European power. I don't mean that part. I mean the age of the actual population, right? Where the majority of the population is technically youth or younger, right? And so to me, the way bigger question is not, is this a gateway to other activism? Is this a gateway to a very different Jordan down the road of people whose what they're willing to talk about, regardless of what the rules are, right, is so much bigger in turn, is so much broader, so much more extensive, that I actually see that as a positive thing. I see it as a hopeful thing. I think Jordan, it sounds like really trite to say the children are the future, but they are, right? They just are. And so teens and 20-somethings in Jordan who have been so incredibly active have been way more innovative than many movements we've seen before, and there's just none of this is going away. So I think this is probably also a good place to end, maybe, and that is that the Arab Spring may be over, but activism is not, and Jordanian politics is not. And I think the interesting part to me is how much continuity and change there is, yeah, but that the struggles in many cases are very often over some of the exact same things. The outcome may be different, but we're still struggling over basic social justice issues, economic livability issues, political inclusion issues, and ultimately what kind of a Jordan is Jordan going to be down the road. Thank you. Actually, I have one other plug for you, by the way. Those of you who are fellow Jordan obsessors, right? This is a relatively new book by Jordanian journalist Rana Suez, right? It's not a political science work, so it reads very differently, but it's actually voices. It selects 10 Jordanians of completely different backgrounds and tells their story, including in their voices. It's just a kind of inside look. I think you might find it really entertaining, right?